If I told you one man convinced the entire United States military to bet everything on a plan that everyone thought was impossible, you'd probably think I was making it up. But this actually happened. And if this gamble had failed, you might be living in a completely different world right now. June 1944. The fate of the entire world hung by a thread. Nazi Germany controlled most of Europe. Millions were suffering under brutal occupation. And sitting in a room in England, one American general was about to make a decision that would either save the world or doom thousands of young men to a catastrophic failure on the beaches of France. His name was Dwight D. Eisenhower. And what most people don't know is that the D-Day invasion, the largest amphibious assault in human history, almost didn't happen. Not because of Hitler, not because of the weather, but because almost everyone in the Allied command thought it was a suicide mission. This is the story of how one man's strategic genius turned what seemed like certain disaster into the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. Let's go back to 1943. The situation in Europe was desperate. Germany had conquered France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, and was pushing deep into the Soviet Union. Britain was hanging on by its fingernails. The United States had entered the war after Pearl Harbor, but there was a massive problem. How do you invade a continent? Germany knew an invasion was coming. They weren't stupid. So they built something called the Atlantic Wall. Imagine thousands of miles of coastline covered with concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, artillery positions, barbed wire landmines, and millions of German soldiers waiting to mow down anyone who tried to land on those beaches. The Germans had been preparing for this moment for years. They had every advantage. They were fighting from defensive positions. They knew the terrain. They had the high ground. And they had some of the best trained, most experienced soldiers in the world. The Allies faced an almost impossible challenge. They had to somehow transport hundreds of thousands of men across the English Channel, land them on heavily defended beaches, break through the Atlantic Wall, and establish a foothold in France before the Germans could push them back into the sea. Military experts looked at this problem, and many of them came to the same conclusion. It couldn't be done. The casualties would be catastrophic. It might be the biggest military disaster in history. But there was no choice. If the Allies didn't invade France and open a second front against Germany, the Soviets might collapse under the German assault. Or worse, the Soviets might make a separate peace with Hitler. Either way, Nazi Germany would control Europe indefinitely. Someone had to figure out how to do the impossible, and that someone was Eisenhower. Here's what's fascinating about Dwight Eisenhower. He wasn't a combat hero. He hadn't led troops in battle during World War I. He spent most of that war training tank crews in Pennsylvania. He was a staff officer, a planner, someone who worked behind the scenes. A lot of generals looked down on him for this. Guys like George Patton and Douglas MacArthur had led men in combat. They had medals and scars and battlefield experience. Eisenhower had a desk and a filing system. But that's exactly why he was perfect for this job. Eisenhower understood something that many combat generals didn't. Modern warfare wasn't just about bravery and tactics on the battlefield. It was about logistics, coordination, getting millions of moving parts to work together at exactly the right time. Think about what D-Day required. You needed to coordinate armies from multiple countries. Americans, British, Canadian, French, Polish, and other Allied forces all had to work together. They all had different equipment, different training, different languages, different military cultures. You needed thousands of ships, landing craft, destroyers, cruisers, battleships. You needed aircraft, fighters, bombers, transport planes, gliders. You needed to stockpile millions of tons of ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies. You needed to train tens of thousands of soldiers in amphibious assault tactics they'd never used before. And somehow, you had to keep all of this secret from the Germans. Most generals would have looked at this puzzle and given up. There were too many variables, too many things that could go wrong. One mistake and the entire invasion could collapse. But Eisenhower saw it differently. He saw it as a problem that could be solved through careful planning, attention to detail, and most importantly, the ability to get people to work together. Let me show you how brilliant Eisenhower actually was by walking you through some of the decisions he made. First, he had to choose where to invade. The obvious choice was Calais. It was the closest point to England. The Channel crossing would be shorter, which meant less time exposed to German U-boats and aircraft. Every German general assumed the Allies would land at Calais. Eisenhower chose Normandy instead. Why? Because it was unexpected. Yes, it was further away. Yes, the crossing would be more dangerous. But the defenses at Normandy were weaker than at Calais. And if you could surprise the Germans, even for a few hours, you could establish a beachhead before they could bring their full force to bear. But here's where it gets clever. Eisenhower knew the Germans expected Calais, so he didn't just invade Normandy. He created an entire fake army in southeast England opposite Calais. They built fake tanks, fake planes, fake buildings. They had fake radio traffic. They even put General Patton in command of this fake army because they knew German intelligence would be watching him. The deception worked. Even after the landings at Normandy began, Hitler kept divisions near Calais because he thought the real invasion was still coming there. Those divisions sat and waited while the Allies were fighting for their lives on the beaches of Normandy. Second, Eisenhower had to solve the weather problem. You can't launch an amphibious invasion in a storm. The landing craft would swamp. The soldiers would be seasick. Visibility would be terrible. But the weather in the English Channel is notoriously unpredictable. Eisenhower needed a day with calm seas, low winds, and a full moon for the paratroopers who would land behind German lines the night before. Those conditions only happened a few days each month, and in early June 1944, the weather was terrible. Storms had been battering the Channel for days. The initial invasion date of June 5th looked impossible. Eisenhower's meteorologist, a British officer named James Stagg, predicted the bad weather would continue. Eisenhower postponed the invasion by 24 hours. Thousands of ships that had already set sail had to turn around and come back. The troops who had been briefed and loaded onto ships had to wait another day, knowing what was coming, fear and tension building. Then Stagg came back with new information. There would be a break in the weather on June 6th. Not perfect conditions, not even good conditions, just a brief window when the weather would be slightly less terrible. Eisenhower had to make a decision, go or no go. If he waited longer, the tides wouldn't be right for another month. Could the invasion be kept secret that long? Could the troops handle another month of waiting? What if the weather in July was even worse? But if he gave the order and Stagg was wrong, if the storm continued, thousands of men might drown before they even reached the beach. Eisenhower sat in a room with his top commanders. The British wanted to wait. The Americans were divided. Everyone looked at Eisenhower. He made the call, they would go. Now let me explain just how insane the logistics of D-Day were. This wasn't just a big battle. This was the most complex military operation ever attempted in human history. Over 150,000 soldiers would land in France on the first day. But you couldn't just sail ships across the Channel and drop them off. The water was too shallow near the beaches. You needed specialized landing craft that could drive right up onto the sand and drop a ramp so troops and vehicles could charge out. The Allies built thousands of these landing craft. Higgins boats, LCTs, LCIs, ducks, strange-looking vessels specifically designed for amphibious assault. They had to be loaded in exactly the right order because the first troops off the boats needed to be combat infantry, not supply units or engineers. Then there were the bigger problems. The beaches at Normandy had no ports. How do you unload millions of tons of supplies without a port? Eisenhower approved one of the craziest solutions ever devised. They would build artificial harbors called mulberries. Huge floating concrete structures that would be towed across the channel and sunk into position off the beaches. Instant harbors. They also laid underwater fuel pipelines called Pluto, pipeline under the ocean, to pump fuel directly from England to France. Because you can't supply an invading army by just shipping barrels of gasoline across the channel. The air campaign was another masterpiece of coordination. Thousands of bombers hit German defenses along the coast, but they couldn't just carpet bomb everything because that would create so much rubble and craters that Allied tanks and vehicles wouldn't be able to move inland from the beaches. Fighter planes had to maintain air superiority over the invasion fleet. Transport planes had to drop paratroopers behind German lines at exactly the right locations and exactly the right time. Gliders carrying troops and equipment had to land in tiny fields in the dark. One mistake in timing, one unit landing in the wrong place, one failed communication, and the entire operation could unravel. Eisenhower coordinated all of this. He dealt with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who wanted to personally go ashore with the troops. Eisenhower had to talk him out of it. He managed American generals like Patton and Bradley, who didn't always get along. He worked with Free French forces who desperately wanted to be part of liberating their homeland. He coordinated with resistance fighters in France who would sabotage German communications and transportation when the invasion began. Every single day, new problems came up. Equipment failures, personality conflicts, supply shortages, intelligence reports of German troop movements, and Eisenhower had to solve each problem while keeping the entire massive operation moving forward toward that narrow window in early June. But here's what really shows you what kind of man Eisenhower was. He knew that no matter how brilliant the plan, no matter how good the coordination, young men were going to die. Thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands. The night before the invasion, Eisenhower visited paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division. These guys were about to jump into occupied France in the middle of the night. Their job was to capture key bridges and roads behind the German defenses. It was incredibly dangerous. Many of them wouldn't survive. Eisenhower walked among them. He talked to them, asked them where they were from, joked with them, made sure they knew their commander cared about them as human beings, not just as pawns on a strategic map. One soldier asked Eisenhower if he could join them on the jump. Eisenhower said he wished he could, but his job was to stay behind and make sure everything kept moving forward. The soldier later said that moment, seeing the supreme commander of all Allied forces taking time to visit them before the most dangerous mission of their lives, gave him courage. But after Eisenhower left the airfield and returned to his headquarters, he sat down and wrote something. It was a short message, just a few sentences. He dated it July 5th, the day before the invasion, and he put it in his pocket. The message said that if the invasion failed, it was entirely his fault. Not the troops, not his subordinate commanders, his alone. He was prepared to take full responsibility for what might be the greatest military disaster in history. That's leadership. That's what made Eisenhower different from so many other generals. He understood that with great authority comes great responsibility. If this gamble failed, he wasn't going to blame anyone else. He was ready to own it completely. June 6, 1944. Shortly after midnight, the first Allied paratroopers began jumping into the darkness over Normandy. Many of them landed miles from their intended drop zones. Some drowned in flooded fields. Others were killed before they even hit the ground. But they accomplished their mission. They caused chaos behind German lines. They captured key bridges. They cut communication lines. And most importantly, they confused the German command about where the main invasion was coming from. At dawn, the naval bombardment began. Thousands of artillery shells slammed into German positions along the coast. Then the landing craft started their run to shore. On some beaches like Utah and Sword, the landings went relatively smoothly. Casualties were lighter than expected. Troops pushed inland quickly. On other beaches, particularly Omaha Beach, it was a nightmare. The naval bombardment had missed many of the German positions. The Germans had the high ground and clear fields of fire. As the landing craft ramps dropped, machine gun fire cut through the Allied soldiers. Men fell in the water. Some drowned under the weight of their equipment. Others made it to the beach only to be pinned down behind obstacles, unable to move forward or back. For hours, the situation at Omaha Beach hung in the balance. If the Germans counterattacked in force, they could push the Americans back into the sea. The entire invasion could fail. But small groups of soldiers, led by junior officers and sergeants, started finding ways through the defenses. They used Bangalore torpedoes to blow gaps in the barbed wire. They flanked German positions. Slowly, painfully, they clawed their way up the bluffs. By the end of the day, all 5 beaches were secured. The Allies had a foothold in France. The Atlantic Wall had been breached. Back in England, Eisenhower waited for reports. He chain-smoked cigarettes, paced. Every casualty report that came in weighed on him. But as the day went on, it became clear that despite the carnage, especially at Omaha Beach, the invasion was succeeding. The gamble had paid off. Over the following days and weeks, the Allies poured men and material into Normandy. They broke out of the beachhead. They liberated French towns and cities. They pushed the Germans back. It wasn't easy. The fighting in Normandy was brutal. The bocage, the Norman hedgerows, created a nightmare landscape for attackers. Every field was a potential killing zone. German resistance was fierce. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. But the Allies had what the Germans didn't: air superiority, industrial might, and an endless stream of supplies flowing through those artificial harbors and pipelines that Eisenhower's planners had created. Here's what a lot of people miss about Eisenhower's genius. D-Day wasn't just about landing on a beach. It was the opening move in a strategic campaign to destroy Nazi Germany. Eisenhower understood that even after securing the beaches, the Allies faced enormous challenges. Germany still had millions of soldiers. They still controlled vast territory. They could counterattack. They could dig in for a long defensive war. So Eisenhower planned beyond the initial invasion. He coordinated with the Soviet offensive in the east. When the Allies landed in Normandy, the Soviets launched Operation Bagration, a massive assault that destroyed German Army Group Center and pushed deep into Poland. This two-front pressure meant Germany couldn't concentrate all its forces against either attack. They had to spread their armies thin. And once you spread a defensive force too thin, gaps appear that attackers can exploit. Eisenhower also approved a second invasion of southern France in August 1944. Operation Dragoon landed Allied forces on the Mediterranean coast and pushed north. Now Germany was being attacked from 3 directions: west from Normandy, east from the Soviet Union, north from southern France. The strategic vice was closing, and it had all started with that gamble on June 6th. Within a year, Nazi Germany would surrender. The war in Europe would be over, and much of the credit belonged to the man who had made all of this possible through careful planning, brilliant coordination, and the courage to make the hardest decision a military commander can make: to risk thousands of lives on a plan that might fail. But we can't talk about D-Day without acknowledging the cost. Over 4,000 Allied soldiers died on June 6 alone. Thousands more were wounded. In the weeks and months of fighting that followed, tens of thousands more would be killed or maimed. Eisenhower never forgot this. Years later, when he was President of the United States, he would sometimes be asked about D-Day. He would talk about the planning, the logistics, the strategic decisions. But he would also talk about the young men he visited before the invasion, the soldiers who had smiled and joked with him, even though they knew many of them wouldn't survive the next day. He carried the weight of their sacrifice for the rest of his life. That's the thing about military genius that people often miss. It's not just about winning battles. It's about understanding that every decision affects real human beings. Every order sends someone's son, brother, father into danger. Eisenhower made the right strategic decisions, but he never lost sight of the human cost of those decisions. And that's what made him not just a brilliant strategist, but a great leader. Let's think about what would have happened if Eisenhower had made different choices, if he had been more cautious, if he had waited for perfect conditions, if he had listened to the voices saying it couldn't be done. The war might have dragged on for years. More millions would have died in concentration camps. More cities would have been bombed to rubble. The Soviet Union might have conquered all of Europe instead of just the eastern half. The world you live in today would be unrecognizable. Or imagine if the invasion had failed. If Eisenhower had chosen the wrong beach, the wrong date, the wrong strategy. If the Germans had been better prepared. If the weather had been worse. If the Allies had been pushed back into the sea. The psychological impact would have been devastating. The Allies had told the world they were coming to liberate Europe. If they failed, would they have the will to try again? Would America's commitment to the war have wavered? Would Britain have sought a negotiated peace? The entire course of the 20th century turned on those decisions Eisenhower made in the spring of 1944. And what's remarkable is that he got them right. Not through luck, but through careful analysis, meticulous planning, and the ability to see the big picture while managing countless details. So what can we learn from Eisenhower's handling of D-Day? What made his approach to this seemingly impossible challenge so effective? First, he understood that complex problems require collaboration. Eisenhower wasn't the smartest person in the room. He wasn't the best combat tactician, but he was exceptional at getting talented people to work together toward a common goal. He managed egos. He smoothed over conflicts. He made sure everyone understood their role and how it fit into the larger plan. In a military culture that often valued individual heroics, Eisenhower built a team. Second, he paid attention to details without losing sight of the strategic objective. Some leaders get so caught up in the big picture that they ignore practical problems. Others get so focused on details that they can't see how everything fits together. Eisenhower did both. He knew which beaches had the right sand consistency for tanks, but he also understood the broader strategic goal of drawing German forces away from the Eastern Front. He could think tactically and strategically at the same time. Third, he was willing to take calculated risks. Notice I said calculated, not reckless. Eisenhower didn't gamble blindly. He gathered intelligence. He consulted experts. He ran through scenarios. But when the time came to make a decision, he made it. He didn't let analysis paralysis stop him from acting. And fourth, he took responsibility. If D-Day had failed, Eisenhower wasn't going to blame the weather or bad intelligence or subordinates who didn't execute properly. He was ready to own the failure completely. That's real leadership. Anyone can take credit for success. It takes character to accept responsibility for failure. Even after the successful landing at Normandy, Eisenhower's strategic genius continued to shape events. Remember that fake army he created to make the Germans think the main invasion would come at Calais. That deception didn't end on June 6th. For weeks after D-Day, the Germans kept powerful divisions near Calais waiting for an invasion that was never coming. They could have rushed those forces to Normandy to push the Allies back. But they didn't, because they still believed Patton's fake army was going to land at Calais. Eisenhower's deception plan worked so well that Hitler himself ordered units to stay near Calais, even as his generals begged to send them to Normandy. By the time the Germans realized they'd been fooled, it was too late. The Allies had broken out of the beachhead and were racing across France. This wasn't just clever, it was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Eisenhower understood that you don't just fight the enemy's army. You fight their perceptions, their assumptions, their ability to understand what's really happening. After the initial success of D-Day, the Allied advance stalled in the Norman hedgerows. This wasn't part of the plan. Eisenhower had expected to break out quickly and sweep across France. Instead, his armies were stuck fighting for every field, every village, every crossroads. The bocage was nightmare terrain. Ancient hedgerows, thick walls of earth and vegetation, divided the countryside into tiny compartments. Tanks couldn't see more than a few dozen yards. Infantry advancing across a field would be cut down by machine gun fire from the next hedgerow over. German defenders used this terrain brilliantly. They would set up in one hedgerow, wait for American soldiers to enter the field, then open fire. When the Americans finally fought their way across and captured that position, the Germans would be waiting in the next hedgerow. Progress was agonizingly slow. Casualties mounted. Some of Eisenhower's subordinates, particularly British General Montgomery, were heavily criticized for not advancing faster. But again, Eisenhower showed his strategic genius. Instead of panicking or making rash decisions, he let his commanders adapt. American soldiers figured out how to weld metal teeth onto the front of tanks so they could bust through the hedgerows. Tactics evolved. Artillery was used more effectively. And Eisenhower approved Operation Cobra, a plan to break through German lines with overwhelming force at a single point, then pour armored divisions through the gap. It was risky. It required concentrating forces, which could be disastrous if it failed. But Eisenhower authorized it. Operation Cobra succeeded. The breakout happened. American tanks raced across France. Paris was liberated. By September 1944, Allied forces were at the German border. December 1944. The war seemed almost over. Allied armies were closing in on Germany from the west. The Soviets were pushing from the east. Most intelligence analysts thought Germany was finished. Then Hitler launched one last desperate gamble. He concentrated his remaining armored forces and smashed through the American lines in the Ardennes forest in Belgium. It was a complete surprise. The Germans pushed deep into Allied territory, creating a bulge in the line. This was Eisenhower's greatest crisis. The carefully coordinated Allied advance had been shattered. American units were surrounded. Confusion reigned. Some officers panicked, thinking this was the beginning of a German counteroffensive that could push the Allies back to the sea. But Eisenhower didn't panic. He immediately saw what was happening. This wasn't a sustainable German offensive. It was a last throw of the dice. Hitler had committed his armored reserves to this attack. If the Allies could hold, if they could contain the bulge, the Germans would have nothing left. Eisenhower made quick decisions. He shifted American divisions north to reinforce the shoulders of the bulge. He gave Patton, who was to the south, permission to wheel his entire army 90 degrees and attack into the southern flank of the German advance. This was improvisation at the highest level. Eisenhower's carefully laid plans had been disrupted, but instead of trying to stick to the original plan, he adapted. He used the principles that had made D-Day successful: coordination, communication, concentration of force, but applied them to a completely different situation. The Battle of the Bulge was brutal. It was fought in winter, in snow and freezing cold. But Eisenhower's quick response prevented disaster. The Germans were contained. Their offensive ran out of steam. By January, the Allies were pushing them back. And just as Eisenhower had predicted, the Germans had shot their bolt. They had no reserves left. The final Allied push into Germany would face weakening resistance. In the spring of 1945, Allied armies crossed the Rhine River and drove deep into Germany. Soviet forces were closing in from the east. Nazi Germany was collapsing. But even here, at the very end, Eisenhower made strategic decisions that would shape the post-war world. British Prime Minister Churchill wanted Allied forces to race to Berlin before the Soviets got there. He was already thinking about the post-war balance of power and didn't want the Soviets to dominate Eastern Europe. Eisenhower refused. He had made agreements with the Soviet High Command about zones of occupation. Berlin was deep in what would become the Soviet zone. Fighting to reach, it would cost tens of thousands of Allied casualties. And for what? The Soviets were going to get it anyway according to the agreements that had already been made. Instead, Eisenhower directed Allied forces to eliminate remaining pockets of German resistance, to cut off potential Nazi redoubts in southern Germany, and to minimize casualties as the war wound down. Some historians criticize this decision, arguing that if Western forces had taken Berlin, the Cold War might have played out differently. But Eisenhower was thinking as a military commander, not a politician. His job was to defeat Germany while preserving as many Allied lives as possible, and that's what he did. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over, and Eisenhower, the staff officer who had never commanded troops in combat before World War II, had led the Western Allies to victory over Nazi Germany. So what did Eisenhower's military genius really achieve? The obvious answer is that he won World War II, but it's more than that. He proved that modern warfare requires more than bravery and tactical skill. It requires logistics, coordination, the ability to manage complex organizations, and the vision to see how thousands of individual actions fit into a strategic whole. He showed that leadership isn't about being the toughest or the smartest person in the room. It's about getting talented people to work together, about making hard decisions when there are no good options, about taking responsibility when things go wrong. And he demonstrated that the greatest gambles in history aren't blind leaps of faith. They're calculated risks based on careful planning, thorough preparation, and the courage to act when the moment comes. If Eisenhower had been more cautious, if he had waited for perfect conditions, if he had listened to the doubters who said it couldn't be done, D-Day might never have happened. The war might have dragged on. The Holocaust might have claimed even more victims. The shape of the modern world would be different. But he wasn't cautious. He made the hard call. He bet everything on a plan that everyone said was impossible, and he won. That's genius. Not just military genius, but leadership genius. The ability to see what needs to be done, to figure out how to do it, to convince others to follow you, and to execute when the pressure is at its highest. Years later, when Eisenhower was president, a reporter asked him about the key to his success. He could have talked about strategy, logistics, or military theory. Instead, he said something simple. He said the key was to treat people right, to give them credit when things go well, to take the blame when things go badly, and to never ask anyone to do something you wouldn't be willing to do yourself. That was the secret behind America's greatest gamble. Not just brilliant planning, not just strategic genius, but human decency, integrity, and the willingness to carry the weight of decisions that would affect millions of lives. On June 6, 1944, when Eisenhower gave the order to launch the invasion, he was betting everything on his judgment, his planning, and the courage of young men who would storm those beaches. It was the biggest gamble in military history, and because of one man's genius, it paid off. The world you live in today exists because Dwight Eisenhower made the right choices at the most critical moment in the 20th century. He saw what needed to be done. He figured out how to do it. And when the time came, he gave the order. That's what real leadership looks like. That's what genius looks like. Not flashy, not dramatic, but effective. Careful planning combined with the courage to act. Attention to detail combined with strategic vision. And above all, the understanding that with great responsibility comes the obligation to do everything in your power to get it right. Because when you're making decisions that will affect the lives of millions, when you're planning operations that will determine the course of history, there's no room for ego or recklessness or passing the buck. There's only the work, the responsibility, and the courage to make the call when everyone's looking to you for an answer. Eisenhower made that call, and the world was never the same. If you want to see more stories about the genius minds that shaped history, hit that subscribe button.